illustration of that. Whenever I kind of make some mild comments about the necessity to kind of control semi-automatic weapons, I invariably get a variety of hate mail that comes in about, messing with other people's guns. Now, in all of this, it seems to me it's very important. I've got my grandson up there who's getting very bored with the whole thing. Telling me to rush on to the conclusion here. We need a systems response to violent extremism. So, as you can see from this quick overview, violent extremism, Islamophobia and mass murder emerge from social, political, economic, religious, cultural, and environmental systems. We nurture these groups in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We nurture lots of much better groups and different kinds of groups, and groups which are freeing and liberating. Environmental movements, women's movements, civil liberties groups, peace movements, movements for protecting nature and so forth. But we have to acknowledge that there are groups that we would not want to be a part of, and there are clubs we wouldn't want to join, that they have a place in our system. It's fine to say that barbarous acts like Christchurch are not us, but the fact is they emerged out of us. They emerged out of New Zealand's relatively peaceful and benign system. And we've got to address their diverse sources, and we have to own them because they are us. So how do we open up a conversation with those who are us but who we don't like? This is the biggest challenge of all. How do we tolerate the intolerant? How do we open up a conversation with those who don't want to talk to us, who want to see their talking done with a gun? Hannah Arendt said, if all are guilty, no one is. In the case of the Christchurch massacre, if one person is guilty, then what's our collective complicity? When we talk about William Pember Reeves in glowing terms, are we also talking about his racism? When we talk about any other person, for their good contributions in the past, are we buying the full package all the time, or do we always have to keep interrogating history in different ways? So there's no single cause of violent extremism, no single source of mass murderers. It's a web of interconnected factors with no quick fixes. So it's really crucial that we begin thinking about all of these things in a holistic way. And we have to do it in terms of context, recruitments, beliefs, planning, and murderous acts. This is just sort of one way in which we might want to do that. And there's a big there are lots of different theories about this cumulative strain theory and general strain theory around how people become criminals. But there's clearly established paths, and there are clearly established stresses and strains which generate people not accepting basic norms and conventions and breaking and doing something which in the normal course of events they probably wouldn't want to do. If we look at this then, where is our peace-building role? Our peace-building role has to do with context. So how do we begin addressing all the sources of inequality, the sources of social isolation, the sources of loneliness, the sources of feeling aggrieved and all of the grievances which people have? How do we put in place, how do we make sure that our institutions and our society is one which doesn't create a right context for murderous belief? If we can't do that and people are moving towards developing extreme views, then how do we counter those views? How do we counter a kind of malign pathological view with a benign normal view of the world, one which is aimed at maintaining unity and integration? And if we can't succeed in those things, how do we respond to murderous acts? I mean, it's not our role to chase after the perpetrator of a murderous crime. It's not our role to remove their weapons. That's the police. So how do we find a place for ourselves here, which means that we can direct most of our resources towards prevention and have the capacity to generate the security that most people need most of the time? There are some contextual factors that correlate very highly with violent extremism. The first have to do with people's sense of self and their own identities. And so we need to be much more tender with each other as we begin acknowledging everybody's right to a place in this community and in this society. And we need to become much more astute at the ways in which we affirm everybody's right to their own identity. Secondly, we need to deal with community-based grievances. Thirdly, we've got to deal with national ideologies. What kind of a nation do we want to live in? What sort of values do we want our nation to espouse? You know, you can just see how gut-wrenching it is in America right now when Trump espouses values which cut across the values of most decent Americans. And at the global level, how do we ensure that what we do has some impact globally and to make sure that the world itself is willing to nurture Aotearoa New Zealand moving in a different direction? So to take the first one on individual identity, and I just want to move through these very quickly, and I'd like to have a lot of time for questions and so forth. The American Psychiatric Association thinks that we need to build individual resilience for social engagement. And so we've got to figure out ways in which we can do this. So how do we make connections? How do we make sure that nobody is falling through the safety net of relationship, so they feel alone and isolated and mistreated and misunderstood and disrespected and humiliated? How do we make sure that happens? Well, one way we do it is by making connections. Secondly, we avoid seeing crises as insurmountable. We have to begin developing a problem-oriented education so that people can address the problems they're facing individually and collectively with some degree of awareness of how to do that. We have to accept that change is a part of living. None of us can go back to the 19th century New Zealand anymore. It's impossible. So why do we keep on bringing back the negative values from the past to create a kind of what we consider to be a more favourable future in the present? How do we kind of work towards goals? How do we establish clear goals for people so that we are open and tender with each other? How do we take decisive action? How do we look for opportunities for self-discovery? How do we nurture positive views of ourselves? And how do we create situations where we can affirm each other? I mean, you know, it's appalling in a way. This is a very dominatory environment. I'm asking you to give me the benefit of your time for 45, 50 minutes, but actually, you know, I should be creating a space for all of us to share your own feelings about these things. And I will as soon as I can. Maintain a hopeful outlook and take care of yourself. And then in terms of responding to individuals who are vulnerable to extremist positions, we've got to figure out how we connect with the socially isolated. Because if you're socially isolated, you feel that the world doesn't, you're living, you feel pointless, you feel alone, and you feel really vulnerable. How do we develop programs that provide all of us with a sense of what it means to be a hero in our own lives? How to be adventurous and significant in non-violent ways? You know, a lot of, you know, Maori crime, for example, you know, has to do with, you know, what do you do if you're living in a warrior tradition, but there's no war? How do we create new kinds of heroism so that we can move on a different kind of heroic journey, each one of us? How do we support those who are in transition, who have just moved to New Zealand, who have just got out of prison, or who can't find a place anywhere? How do we deal with fear and anxiety? This is critical, and we need to develop programs that enable us to do that. How do we take humiliation seriously? And because so much violence flows from disrespect and a lack of dignity, so that we ensure that we don't humiliate our school children. We don't humiliate those at preschool. We don't humiliate people in our own families. We don't humiliate people in the university. We don't humiliate people anywhere. And if we do, I mean, that's as countless as assaulting them. And how do we develop mental health programs? You know, most of the mass murderers, the good profile, are adolescents. Their brains have not quite developed. Many of them are under 25, or just between 25 and 30. There's a huge amount of sexual confusion which gets put into this. and the whole question of hypermasculinity. So dealing with this individual identity issue means we have to grapple with some of these questions, and we have to figure out what mechanisms and institutions are capable of doing that. So if we look at community grievances, we've got to figure out ways in which we can respond to political, economic and social grievances early and effectively. If we've got large numbers of people unemployed or underemployed or not able to make a living, that's not okay, and it does create ripe conditions. The person I was talking about in America, Paula Green, is running this wonderful program which he calls Hands Across the Hills. And it's a conversation, a dialogue between Democrats who voted for Hillary Clinton and people from Kentucky who voted overwhelmingly for Trump. And what they're discovering is lots of commonality, but then they can't avoid the fact that those in Kentucky have no economic future. They're feeling completely marginalized. And when they're confronted with no economic future, it doesn't help them to have people come from Massachusetts, with academic backgrounds and good retirements. So how do we create mechanisms for dealing with political and economic grievances? How do we ensure that no one is left behind and that economic and social policies are inclusive and remove that sense of economic marginalization? And how do we keep on promoting intergroup dialogue programs to enhance social cohesion and well-being? And this is really key. This is the kind of thing that Greg and others in the interfaith groups are doing. These dialogue groups, they may seem inconsequential, but in fact, they're rather important.